Hey everybody, this is Deb with Truthification Chronicles, and if you recall back in April of 2018, this came out on the Department of Justice website, and the founder of NXIVM, a purported self-help organization, and actor indicted for sex trafficking and forced labor conspiracy. And this was about Allison Mack, who was the actor, and Keith Raniere, also known as Vanguard. And they were both charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, and forced labor conspiracy. And so this was something that came out, like I said, in 2018. And we just got the conviction. This was on the 19th, sorry. And so, yes, Keith Raniere was found guilty on all counts in sex cult case. Jury sided with prosecutors who said Raniere used blackmail. Now, remember that, blackmail and starvation to force women into becoming first-line slaves. So blackmail is a big part of things, and that's what we have to remember with the whole sex trafficking thing. This is a major part of it. I mean, they do this in order to entrap these people with power so that they can manipulate them. You know, then they become their little puppets and have to dance according to what they tell them to so that they, won't release this information about them. That's how blackmail works, right? So, Keith Raniere, a self-help guru, has been found guilty of presiding over an ultra-secretive society that imprisoned women as sex slaves branded with his initials. Now, as I've said before, for 13 years, I helped run an online biblical counseling ministry in Yahoo Chat. And during that time, we had a lot of people that would come into our chat rooms and would talk to us that were involved in some pretty weird stuff. Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are caught up in secretive societies, things that present themselves as, honest self-help, or even in the case of what we dealt with, they pretend that they're Christian organizations, and they end up being something very secretive because they're doing bad stuff. And so, this is a real thing that's going on, not just with this guy. I mean, he's high profile, and you're going to see why in just a minute. But, there's happening to a lot of people on a lower level, too. You get this one person who is very charismatic, and I'm sorry, but it's usually a man. Now, I'm not a man hater, okay? Don't get me wrong. But usually it's a man, and he has power that he exerts over women. And we have women who tend to go for that. And I have a whole theory about that, but it's not for this video. Anyway, with this, this guy not only had them in this ultra-secretive society, but he branded them with his initials. I mean, this is just really horrible. Now, you may have heard about this, but I don't think it's had the place it should have had in the mainstream media, because this is huge. And it's going to lead to a lot of other things. It's going to be kind of a domino effect, because this was kind of a kingpin here, that if you could get him, he had a lot of connections, and this sex trafficking that he was dealing with was a lot bigger than just here in the United States. And we're going to get to that in a minute here. So look what it says. The case established an unexpected link between an organization preaching self-empowerment and an internal cult-like subgroup dedicated to serving the carnal and now criminal demands of its founder. Unexpected link, come on. Really, it's not unexpected for me, because I've seen this happen many, many times. Raniere, who claimed to be one of the smartest people in the world, I think he claimed that he had 3 degrees, and he probably didn't even have one, like in college, and boasted a devoted following, was found guilty of all counts against him, including racketeering, forced labor, sex trafficking, and child abuse images charges. Now notice the only word child here is used with child abuse images. Okay, we're going to talk about that too as we go on. The jury reached their decision in less than 5 hours of deliberations. And really, that kind of means it was pretty much a slam dunk, because the evidence was so obvious and overwhelming. After the verdict was handed down, Richard Donahue, who was the U.S. attorney that was, for the Eastern District of New York, who was prosecuting this, told reporters Raniere was truly a modern-day Svengali whose crimes and the crimes of his co-conspirators ruined marriages, careers, fortunes, and lives. And that's probably one reason why it didn't get so much play, because the people who should have been reporting on it might be caught up in this, or at least residually. So, yeah. Anyway, they wouldn't want that information to get out. Raniere, who portrayed himself as a savant and a genius, was in fact a master manipulator, a con man, and the crime boss of a cult-like organization involved in sex trafficking, child pornography, extortion, compelled abortions, branding, degradation, and humiliation, Donahue added. Now that's the U.S. attorney saying that. So, yeah, that was the stuff this guy was caught up in. Throughout the 7-week trial, the 58-year-old former multivitamin salesman sat stony-faced and attentive as prosecutors presented lurid and often disturbing evidence that has shocked New York and much of America, although not as much as it should because it really hasn't been covered. With testimony of how abuse and exploitation mingled with celebrity and a cult of personality at the self-help organization NXIVM. But aside from entering a plea of not guilty, Raniere himself revealed nothing. The man known to his followers as Supreme Master or Vanguard did not take the stand, nor did he call any witnesses to rebut prosecutors' narrative that he used NXIVM to recruit victims for a group known as DOS. And that's going to come up in several other documents I'm going to show you. So DOS, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, which is Latin for the Lord of the Obedient Female Companions. Oh, yippee-ki-yay. People like this. Anyway, which was committed to the enslavement and abuse of young women. Nor did he seek to challenge physical evidence against him, which included pornographic pictures allegedly taken for the purposes of blackmail and apparatus related to sexual domination. Which, is not necessarily illegal, but if he was using it with young girls or using it in a fashion that was not consensual, then yeah, that could be an issue. Anyway, a guy like this who is having some kind of mind control manipulation over people, this, as I said, is more common than you would think. We had several women that we worked with on a regular basis who had been involved with lower levels of this kind of manipulation. And one time I was in Texas, and it happened to be just before a major event happened there, and that was this Andrea Yates. In fact, we were actually in Texas for the conference that I was speaking at on June 20th, and that was the date that this happened. Now, I don't know if you have heard the story of Andrea Yates or not. Now, we did not work with her, okay? I want to clarify that. I did not work with her. I've never talked to her. I don't know her at all. But when we heard that this happened, the pastor that I worked with and I, we were pretty positive that there was some root in there that had to do with some manipulative man who had taken over and had filled her minds with some really bad stuff. That's exactly what happened. Now, I know if you've watched any of the stuff about her, it always says that she was suffering from severe postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, and schizophrenia. Now, I'm not saying she wasn't suffering from those, but that wasn't the catalyst that caused her to drown her 5 children. What happened there and the reason behind it, which nobody, of course, in the mainstream media wants to pinpoint this, but it's very clear, and if you do the digging on it, you can find this out. It's not in this article, and it all has to do with a guy named Woronicki. And I wrote an article, this is from my old website, and it is old and it's bad looking, so please ignore how it looks. But the article itself, I think, will explain. If you're not a Christian, you may not understand this, and it may not make sense to you. It may not be something you want to read. But when we were dealing with this, this was a matter of this woman's mind was filled by this Woronicki guy with a bunch of false information about what Christianity was, about who God was, and this is what really messed her up. And then when she had the baby and, she was in this postpartum depression phase, that's what kicked it in, was because of everything this guy had told her. And his name, let me find it here. It's somewhere in this. Michael Woronicki. And this was a really serious situation where this guy had control not over just her, but her husband as well. He even got them to live in this tiny little trailer, and there were 5 kids and the mother and father all living in this tiny trailer just so they could follow this Woronicki around, because he was almost a little god to them. And people like this, I mean, you've got examples of this where it's someone who takes Christianity and they twist it around to use it for their purposes. This is what happened with Jim Jones. I mean, I'm sure most of you have heard about the Jim Jones cult, where they were down in Guyana and all these people mass suicided. Well, if you go back to it, the heart of it was doctrinal issues. He took Christian beliefs and he twisted them around, and he made people think they were actually worshiping and following God and his leading, when they weren't at all. They were following Jim Jones. And same thing here with this Michael Woronicki. This guy, the more you look into him, he was way off. And he had convinced this woman that the only way her children were ever going to make it to heaven was if they died as children. And so she helped them along, which is extremely sad. And at the time, this stuff was not as prevalent as it is today, but it's become a lot more prevalent now. And I remember, again, when this happened, like I said, we were just getting ready to speak on this conference. And sure enough, that happened. And I didn't get a chance to look into it at the time, but shortly thereafter, because we were there and we were like blocks from where this all happened, when it happened, it was very impactful on us. And we did the research. Even back then I was doing digging, and yeah, this was really at the heart of this. I'm not saying that she wasn't depressed from having the child. I'm not saying that. But the real catalyst was this Woronicki guy and his false teachings and his manipulation of her. And it's the same kind of manipulation that went on here with this Keith Raniere, because I've seen it happen way too many times. And I have worked with some women who have been under lesser forms of this, but it's out there and it does happen more than you would think. So anyway, this goes on and it talks about, only in opening statements and closing arguments did Raniere present any explanation, offering through his defense counsel that whatever had taken place was consensual. See, that's what he's trying to say, that it was all consensual. But the jury did not agree. And they said, this is more than that. The jury rejected that explanation, siding with prosecutors who said Raniere used blackmail, forced starvation, and other coercive techniques to force DOS women into becoming first-line slaves. And he faces a life sentence. Yay! I hope that's what he gets. Really. He deserves worse than that, honestly. DOS argued U.S. Attorney Mauro Pensa was formed to satisfy the defendant's desire for sex, power, and control. And this is how these guys work. And again, I have worked with some women who were part of lesser people than this, but still, it had quite an effect. I mean, they didn't have the following. That's what I mean when I say lesser, because they may have only had power over 5 or 6 women instead of as many as he had. So it's still awful. It doesn't mean that he's less of a criminal. They're all criminals if they're doing this kind of garbage. The Cult of Education Institute estimates there may be thousands of cults in the U.S. Yeah, thousands of cults. I'm telling you, I believe that. But prosecutions are rare because abusive behavior is not necessarily criminal, and proving that cult followers are not acting of their own free will is notoriously hard to prove. They are, in a way, acting under their own free will, but in another way, they are so manipulated, and often they're threatened, so that they feel if they say anything, that they will be killed, or that people they love will be killed. That's almost more of a threat than having your own life threatened. And this is what they use a lot of times. There are threats like that, but one of the biggest threats, and this is something that I hope you don't get mad at me for saying this, but women tend to be very aware of social ostracization. Okay. I wrote an article, and I'll put a link to it down below, on my old blog that talked about how men and women perceive bullying differently. Okay, men tend to see bullying, when you say someone's being bullied, in a man's mind, typically they will think more of how somebody's getting beat up, physically punched, physically pushed around, physically intimidated. Whereas for women, a lot of times the bullying takes on a different form, and it's more of an social ostracization, because, women really are more social and interactive, and it's harder for them to be alone and to be pushed out of their social group than it would be for a man. Now, I'm not saying in all cases, I'm just saying generally. It's not, obviously you may break that mold either way. I tend to be a little more individualistic, and so it doesn't bother me as much. But this tends to be how in general women perceive bullying. And because of that, when they are in a situation like this, one of the things that almost all cults that I have had to deal with over the years had in common, they would all start out and they would make the person feel so warm and loved, like they were just the center of their attention. And then they would slowly but surely separate them from anyone in their lives, all their old friends or their family. They cut them off. And once they have them cut off, then they can start to do the mind control things. And when they start manipulating the mind control, then they've got them at a point where they are so dependent on the group, this new social family, if you want to say it that way, that they can't stand the idea of being put out of the group, because they've already burned all their bridges with all their friends and their family. So now they don't really have anyone. And a lot of how you deal with life and its problems will depend on what kind of resources you have. And when I say resources, I don't mean necessarily financial resources. I mean what kind of emotional resources you have. Like if you've got a supportive family, and if you have friends that you can count on and who are there for you no matter what, you have more of an ability to be able to handle really difficult situations. If you're by yourself, if you don't have the friends, you don't have a supportive family, it makes it very difficult. You have to rely only on yourself. And because of that, you have less emotional resources to fall back on. So it makes it more difficult for you to handle things. And the likelihood of you having problems handling it, probably it's going to be much higher. And it's not saying that it's your fault or anything. I'm just saying that because you don't have the same resources as somebody who has that broad base that they can rely on and who can help them out. So this is one of the things that these cults all seem to have in common. They will get you to the point where you are so reliant on the cult for your affirmation, to know that you're loved and you're cared for. That's who you get all of your sustenance from, your emotional sustenance. So the thought or threat of losing that is huge. And it's a great tool that these cults use on people that they're trying to manipulate. And it's very, very powerful, especially, and I'm sorry, ladies, but especially for ladies. It really is for us women, because we tend to need that emotional support a little more than men do. And again, it's not totally across the board, but for the most part, by and large, that's how it works. That's how God created us. It's not a bad thing, because, he did a good job putting the two different types of people together, a man and a woman. It works really well because we have different strengths. And again, I did write an article on that. I did a whole series actually on the hatred of men, the misandry, and everything out there. But I wanted to point out to you that in these cases where they have these manipulative men, they're using that part of our womanhood against us. And it's really sad and disgusting and despicable that a guy would stoop that low to exert that kind of power over women. And that's really what this guy did. that he was using their emotions against them. And I really hate hearing that about people because, again, I've heard far too many of those instances over the years. And it's a sad thing. And so, with NXIVM, allegations of blackmail and the presence of a child victim pushed accusations of cult control into the criminal realm via human trafficking statutes. Now, the presence of a child victim, I don't know, maybe that came out in the court, but I thought it was kind of interesting that they mentioned that. The court documents themselves do not indicate anything about children, at least not that I've seen, because the victims that were named, I believe, were all of age. Okay? But we'll look at those later. The trial featured testimony from 4 women, Sylvie, Daniela, Jay, and Nicole, whose full names were withheld because they were considered victims, as well as several former members whose identities were revealed. And these 4 women here were actually adults, or at least of age. I don't know how old they were, but yes, they were old enough that they were not considered children. But I'll show you the statute in a minute, why there has been some link to that whole child trafficking thing. And the former members whose identities were revealed, one was Lauren Salzman, daughter of the NXIVM co-founder, Nancy Salzman, who told jurors how she became Raniere's slave and recruited other slaves for herself. So she became a recruiter, this Lauren Salzman. Well, Lauren Salzman is the daughter of Nancy Salzman, and she has already been tried for this, and she pleaded guilty in sex cult case, and this was back March 13th of this year, and she broke down in tears Wednesday as she admitted to hacking into emails of the group's perceived enemies and destroying evidence that could be used against them. She pleaded guilty to a single charge of racketeering conspiracy, sobbed as she apologized for drawing her daughter Lauren, who is also charged in the case, into the group, which prosecutors have described as a perverted pyramid organization. And it really was. It was to make him money, and to make his lifestyle what he wanted it to be. And so, anyway, she was known as the Prefect. She co-founded this self-help group. Self-help, yeah, right. And it was back in the 1990s. And Raniere, alongside Smallville actress Allison Mack and Seagram heir Claire Bronfman and Salzman's daughter Lauren, still face sex trafficking, kidnapping, money laundering, and other charges for allegedly coercing women into having sex with Raniere. Yeah. So, this is the story right here about her. As always, I'll put these links down below and you can look at it there. And so I just think that these people, again, I've worked with enough women to know that it happens subtly and it's not like all at once. So it kind of creeps up with you. I'm sure by now you've heard the illustration of the frog. How do you boil a frog alive? Well, you put him in a pot of room temperature water and then you slowly turn up the heat. And before you know it, the frog will boil because he can't sense that change in temperature. And unfortunately, this is how these cults work. That they start out, like I said, all nice and loving, and you are wonderful, and then they just slowly turn up the heat. And before you know it, you're under this control. And as I said, sadly, there are more of these out there than people know. And sometimes it's a small group, 2 or 3 women. Sometimes it's a lot more. And I'm hoping that, this is the start of prosecuting some of these people. Now, if you go through, of course, you have Allison Mack. This Mack starved women until they fit her co-defendant's sexual ideal under the guise of female empowerment. Ladies, I have another idea for female empowerment. If you understand the biblical role of women, you will be empowered. So, yeah, really. I can share that with you sometime. I'm not going to do it here. So they go on and, all 4 women testified about being members of DOS. Remember, that's that subgroup, I guess they call it, his little inner circle of sex slaves. While the court heard evidence of a 5th, Daniela, who was restricted to a room for a year after showing interest in a man other than Raniere. And I know you sit here and you think, well, how can they possibly put up with this? Well, they put up with it, like I said, because they've been cut off from all their other emotional resources, and this group becomes their only sole source of emotional support. And that allows creeps like this Raniere to take a lot of liberties with them that they would not have put up with otherwise, but they just don't have the emotional resources to be able to stop participating in all of this. They so badly want to be loved and accepted that they will do whatever is asked of them. And it's a sad thing, but unfortunately, we're all very susceptible if they hit the right buttons. And it doesn't happen overnight. That's what I got to impress on you. It takes time to get them to this point, but once they're there, and sometimes with some of these people, it was blackmail. I mean, they had the documents that could keep them from running to anybody and telling anyone what was really going on. So, blackmail is a horrible thing. So, the unassuming suburban locality proved a perfect foil for the brutal behavior within. Prosecutors said the group's homes, one of which included a dungeon, functioned as the set of a horror movie. And, this one had a woman, her arms above her head like a sacrifice, screaming. Yeah, these people, they were just sick, absolutely sick. And like I said, Claire Bronfman was part of it. And see, the thing is, she was the Seagram's, heiress. And she had, like, all this money at her disposal. So she was bankrolling them. Yeah, again, it's amazing what some people will do for love and affection. Even if it's distorted love and affection. It's a twisted type of love. This is what was going on. And so, if you go through and read this, it's a fraud, it's a lie. Yeah, it was all that. The whole thing was a fraud and a lie. It's a well-intended veneer that covers horrible evil. And that really was what was going on. So, we have this Nancy Salzman. Well, Nancy Salzman and the Bronfmans and a lot of people have a connection to the Clinton Foundation. Now, I know that surprises you. Not, but this is something. They did give illegal campaign donations at event in hopes of obtaining political influence to further their agenda. Now, I am somebody who says you can't stop people from donating to you. So I don't think a candidate should be held responsible for the people that donate to them unless they have asked those people to donate. Okay? And in this case, I don't know what the situation is, but there have been some rumors, and I'm going to say it that way. I've not seen any legitimate connection between the people in the NXIVM cult and the Clinton Foundation, except that they gave money. And again, you can't hold the candidate responsible for people that give money to them. You can't blame them if unsavory people donate to them. But you can if they spend time with them. And I think there was more to it than that. The information I heard was that these members of NXIVM, some of the higher up ones, were part of the Clinton Foundation or the Clinton Initiative, I'm not sure which one, and that they had to pay like $15,000 membership fee to be part of it and all that. And that's a little bit different than just donating to somebody's campaign. So I don't know. I have not been able to find actual documentation to back that up. Okay? I've heard a lot of people saying it. I've heard it rumored a lot, but I haven't found the documentation. So until I find the documentation, I'm going to hold that on the maybe category. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know for sure. I'm not going to take a stance on it. But I did find this article on FactCheck.org, which I wouldn't totally hold, as truth. And it was under Debunking False Stories. False Story Ties Sex Cult to Clintons. Well, this was put out on May 2nd, 2018. And the question was, did actress Allison Mack confess to selling children to the Clintons and Rothschilds? No, Mack has pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking charges. She has not confessed to selling children to anyone. Okay, now that is not necessarily so. And I think it's very misleading, especially in the way it's worded and everything. So it implies that she is not at all guilty. Well, we do know now that she is guilty. And, goes through it and talks, there's no truth in a story that appeared on some websites that the actress confessed that she sold children to the Rothschild and Clintons. Okay, this article that they're referring to came out on yournewswire.com. Now, I want to caution you about using that source. I don't think it's a valid source. It may once in a while have accurate information on it, because, even a broken clock is right twice a day. But I would not use that as a source. If you can't find it anywhere but on there, don't use it. It's not going to be verified well enough for somebody like me. I'm not going to accept it unless you can validate it on other sites that are more reliable. Now, be careful, because if you find an article on there and you take a quote from it and you Google it, you may end up with other things that say exactly the same text, but they're just repeating it. Please be careful of that. If you can't find it on a site that is better known and is more reliable, be careful, because they like to make up stories. And I don't know anything about the newly press. Sorry, don't know that at all. But be very careful about where you get your information. Now, again, this makes it seem like, well, she's not indicted on anything doing with child sex trafficking and everything. Well, as you saw in the previous article, there was an indication that Keith Raniere had child pornography. So there is a connection there. Now, the real connection comes because of the indictment. And here is her indictment. This came out April 19th, 2018. And you can see here that this is for the U.S. Court, Eastern District of New York, and the docket number and everything. I know it's a little blurry, but Title 18, United States Code, Section 1591, and we're going to look at that in a minute. Sex trafficking of children. That's what everybody's been focusing on. And that's why people are connecting it in. That, and of course, the 17th letter of the alphabet has told us that it will eventually be connected in with the child trafficking. But something that you need to notice is this word "or" here. Or by force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, so it's not necessarily trafficking of children. It could be, but this "or" also makes it something different. And that's because that is right here. You can see this is the U.S. Code, Title 18, Crimes and Criminal Procedure, Part 1, Crimes, and Chapter 77, Peonage, Slavery, and Trafficking in Persons. And if you go down here to 1591, that's this one right here, sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, or coercion. So even if it's an adult, it still can fall under this just because of that or by force, fraud, or coercion. So that's what I think it really is. I don't think that Allison Mack was guilty of child sex trafficking. I think she may possibly have had some girls that were close to underage. Maybe they were slightly underage, but not very much. They would have been like older teenagers. So that's one of the confusions that's out there. Now, if you go to her actual indictment, this is the full thing here. This is the court document. And remember that this was an unsealed indictment because, you see, it was unsealed. And so that's really important that we remember that. A lot of times people are saying, well, they say there's all these sealed indictments, and it's over 100,000 right now. And yes, there are a lot of sealed indictments. The only thing is, a lot of them are also being unsealed, and we're just not noticing it because that's all it appears as. It was an indictment unsealed today. So, if you look for indictment unsealed or an unsealed indictment, when you're searching, you can usually find several of them, especially in this past year. So this is her actual indictment, and it's also Keith Raniere's because they were both on the same indictment here, which is another thing to keep in mind, that the indictments could be for more than one person. So count one, they have Jane Doe's 1 and 2, and they don't name the women, again, like that one article said. They're not naming them, but this is what they're indicted for, these two. together with others, did knowingly and intentionally recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, advertise, maintain, patronize, and solicit one or more persons, to wit, Jane Does 1 and 2, individuals whose identities are known to the grand jury, in and affecting interstate and foreign commerce, and attempting to do the same, and to benefit and attempt to benefit financially and by receiving a thing of value from participation in a venture which had engaged in such acts, knowing that means of force, threats of force, fraud, and coercion, and a combination of such means would be used to cause such persons to engage in one or more commercial sex acts. And here are the codes. And again, 1591 was that one code back here I showed you. 1591. Sex trafficking of children, or by force, fraud, or coercion. Okay, so it goes on, and you can read the whole thing, but nowhere in here does it mention under either one of these anything about children or underage women. So that's why I said this was not about the underage children being trafficked or anything like that. It's the or part of that statement. Here's a letter about Raniere asking the judge not to let him out on bail because the guy is a slime ball. Yeah. So it goes through and it says that they ask for him, to is scheduled to appear for arraignment, and the government respectfully submits this letter in anticipation of the defendant's expected removal to the Eastern District of New York, and in support of the government's request for a permanent order of detention. And as set forth below, the defendant, who was living in Mexico prior to his arrest and has access to vast resources, poses a significant risk of flight. Actually, this is a very good document. I think it's easier to read this not in quite as legal speak as this one is, the actual indictment. But if you read through this gives you a summary of what was going on. A defendant is charged by complaint with sex trafficking, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit forced labor, as described in detail in the complaint, the facts of which are incorporated by reference into this letter. These charges arise from the defendant's role as the leader of a secret society called DOS, or the Vow, in which women were recruited to be slaves under the false pretense of joining a women's only mentorship group. Now, the reason I have that highlighted is because that is so important to this whole mentality of exercising control of them, because they were offering these women a women's only mentorship group, which was like a promise to them of an emotional support group. So emotional resources. And so these women got into it expecting to be uplifted by other women. In reality, what these women in charge were doing was turning them into slaves. And it didn't happen overnight. That's what I've got to impress on you. These things do not happen overnight. They happen gradually over time. And that's how this all works together. And it says it was structured as a pyramid with the defendant, who's Keith Raniere, at the top. To join DOS, slaves were required to provide their masters with collateral, which included highly damaging information about themselves and or family members, naked photographs, and rights to their assets. Now, of course, people are going, why in the world would anybody ever give somebody that information? Again, remember, it happens gradually. And they build it as this women's only mentorship group. So these women were brought in. They were promised this relationship with these women who appeared to have everything together and were doing really well and living an expensive lifestyle and everything, and they were enticed to join. Oh, come join us. And remember, women are joiners. We tend to join things a little easier than most men. Although I'm weird, I'm pretty independent, so I don't join a lot of things. So this was something that they gave up because they so wanted to be accepted by that social group. It was a trade-off. And they, at the time, because they wanted it so badly, they were willing to pay that price. And so, of course, once they had joined, slaves learned they had to provide additional collateral, which they did, fearing that otherwise the collateral they'd already provided would be used against them. None of the slaves, except for those directly under the defendant, knew that the defendant was involved in the organization when they were recruited, because they thought it was this women's mentorship group. That's what they were told at first. So they didn't know they were going to get attached to this Keith Raniere guy. Yeah, they didn't even know him. They didn't know he was involved. DOS slaves understood that if they told anyone about DOS, which is another thing the cults do, don't tell anybody, it's our secret. That's what abusers do, by the way, too. If they left DOS or if they failed to complete assignments given to them by their masters, their collateral could be released. A number of DOS slaves, including Jane Does 1 and 2, as described in the complaint, were given assignments that implicitly or expressly directed them to have sex with the defendant. Yeah, that's this assignment. And I know, it's so easy to sit back and say, well, I would have just said, no, I'm not going to do that, and walk away. But by the time they get to this point where they are tasked with doing this, so much has happened to set up the environment, to cut them off from the outside, from their emotional resources outside of this group, that they are so dependent and so eager to be accepted by this group that they're willing to do things like that. I know it's hard to believe, but it happens all the time. And so, anyway, it goes on, and, it's other things that they were asked to do. They were told that these orders were to benefit themselves, and different things that they were asked. It's sad, but it can happen, and it can happen to good people. They just are desperately looking for some acceptance and love. And it's sad that we're in a situation in our society now that people get caught up in things like this just because they really want to be loved and accepted. So this part I wanted to show you, this history of sexual assault and other abuse of girls and women. This is the first time I see the term girls used in this whole thing. And this is, although this is a court document, it is not the indictment. So evidently there's something in the past, but I don't know that he was ever charged with it. The defendant has a decades-long history of abusing women and girls. According to confidential sources, the defendant had repeated sexual encounters with multiple teenage girls in the mid to late 1980s and early 1990s. In one instance, the defendant met a 15-year-old girl while he was in his 20s and had repeated sexual contact with her. In another instance, the defendant met a 12-year-old girl whose mother worked for the defendant and began tutoring her. Shortly thereafter, the defendant began having regular sexual intercourse with her, including at his home where he lived with multiple adult sexual partners. One of those partners hired the girl to walk her dog, giving the defendant daily access to the girl. The defendant told one of the DOS slaves he had sex with that he believed the age of consent was too rigid and that it should be lowered to when a child's parent says the child is capable of consent. Yeah, he must be friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Anyway, so it goes on, and I mean, it's really disgusting what this guy says, but I wanted to show you this part. Defendant's foreign ties and access to cash. For most of his life, the defendant has lived outside Albany, New York, where NXIVM is headquartered. Many members of NXIVM live in the same area. Shortly after the government began interviewing witnesses and victims in November 2017, that was about the time the 17th letter of the alphabet was starting to get active. Well, it was the end of October, but just like the last few days. And so November, he was really starting to ramp up. And I wonder if this was not part of, that whole thing. And one of the reasons why he felt he could then start coming out, because this was all being put in place. The defendant flew to Mexico. For over a month and a half since the arrest warrant in this case was issued, the government has actively worked with Mexican immigration officials to locate the defendant. Finding the defendant was difficult because the defendant purposely concealed his location, began using end-to-end encrypted email, and stopped using his phone. Ultimately, the defendant was found to be staying at a luxury villa near Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, with several women. The villa was in a gated community where some villas cost over $10,000 U.S. currency a week to rent. The defendant was uncooperative when immigration authorities arrived, and after he was taken into custody, the women chased the car in which the defendant was being transported in their own car at high speed. Yeah. The defendant pretends to be a renunciate. I think that's supposed to be renunciant. I think there's an N in there. Anyway, it means somebody that renounces the whole world, that they're not interested in worldly things. Yeah. In reality, however, he has spent his life profiting from his pyramid schemes and has otherwise received financial backing from independently wealthy women. The defendant is currently financially backed by Claire Bronfman, an heiress to the Seagram's liquor fortune. She has financed the defendant repeatedly over the years, including providing him with millions of dollars and paying for private air travel, costing up to approximately $65,000 a flight. She has also paid for numerous lawyers to bring suits against NXIVM critics. Bronfman also owns a private island in Fiji, which the defendant has visited. And both Bronfman and the defendant have contacts all around the world. Well, we know about those private islands, don't we? Yeah, they can do pretty much anything they want to on those private islands. In this one, the defendant does not keep any money in his name and has no driver's license. He makes purchases using a credit card in one of his dead lover's names. Isn't that fraud? I mean, that alone he should be, in jail for. But yes, he has now been convicted of these other charges, so. In the past year and a half, the defendant and the mother of his child have accessed hundreds of thousands of dollars from a bank account in the same dead lover's name, which contains over $8 million. And then you can go through, you can see all the rest of the stuff. So, yeah, that one I think is pretty telling, this document right here. And this was written back, let me go back here. It was written, March 26th. Of 2018, so over a year ago. And then I came across this document. This is a request that they, that these dates be excluded from the computation of the time period within which a trial of the charges against defendant must commence. And this is for Allison Mack here. The parties seek the exclusion of the foregoing period because they are engaged in plea negotiations, which they believe are likely to result in disposition of this case without trial, and they require an exclusion of time in order to focus efforts on plea negotiations without the risk that they would not, despite their diligence, have reasonable time for effective preparation for trial. So that's what they're asking for here, and this is very interesting. This came out, when was this dated? Well, it was filed 4/20/18. And if you've been following the 17th letter of the alphabet, he actually said that she was naming names and that she was working on a plea deal before this came out. So, yeah, it's very interesting. That was a proof right there. So, I wanted to include all these documents. I got them from the bottom of this. They included them down here, so you can go and see them for yourself. But it's very interesting that they, are giving this information and saying they're debunking. Well, they kind of are. Some of it is false. But this is how things work. The story of the dog poop brownies. It only takes a little bit to destroy the whole thing. And so with this, when they're saying, well, she didn't confess to selling children, okay, to the Clintons and Rothschilds. She hasn't really said that. We don't have documentation of that. But she was naming names, and you got to wonder what names she was naming. So, Mack has pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking charges. Well, I don't think she has, because she's working on a plea deal, which means she's likely going to have to plead guilty in that plea deal. So, I think she's going to have to admit that she actually did that. And I don't think she's been arguing it. I think she's been okay with saying, yeah, she did it. I don't think she's denying it at all. But the children, the problem with that was people were confusing it with this, this case here, because it does say sex trafficking of children or by force fraud. And so they were taking it as the children was part of it. So we can't quite do that. We can't really say that. So let's be careful. Anyway, that's what I've got for you on this one. Please share it, especially, this is in the news and people may hear about it. This is a really good article to share, though, because you see just how scummy this guy was. But I wish more people had heard about it. And they need to understand that this is just the first one. And there's going to be a domino effect after this, because there's going to be a lot of people that this is going to lead to, because as that document said, he's had connections all over the world. So yeah, he's got connections everywhere. And you know, that island in Fiji, I'm sure they didn't just go there to have little fancy little parties. I think it was a lot more serious. So who knows what they were doing there. And it's all going to start coming out. It really is, because these people are so guilty. And the more this comes out, I think it's going to have to be out in the public square, and people are going to have to see it and talk about it. And that's why I understand this is a difficult subject. I haven't spent a lot of time on the NXIVM stuff, because it is just so horrific that they did this. I mean, they did this to women. This is a war on women that they were committing, you know, this crime. And so all of us women should be outraged at something like that. So I wanted to share this with you. And I know it's a tough subject. I don't do these often, but I felt like I really needed to do this one to let you know what was going on, and that you can read the documents for yourself. Everything will be down in the links below, so you can read those. Lots of stuff, I know, but important stuff, I think. We need to make people aware of what's really going on in our world, even if it's an ugly truth, right? So I want to thank you for stopping by, and I'll see y'all later.